Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. Joined this morning by my teachers and friends, Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University and Rabbi Marc Gellman of South Florida and the Aspen Jewish Congregation. Good morning, friends. Shabbat
Good
Shalom.
morning. Good morning. Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom.
shalom.
This morning we opened the second Torah portion of the Torah, which is the story of Noah and the Ark. It's a very familiar story to everyone, but we want to talk about some of the details of the story. And I'd like to spend a moment talking about its setting so that we get a sense of how really deeply profound this is. Now, if you look at the setting of this story in the book of Genesis, we are introduced last week in Breshit, in the beginning, to a God who has dreams, a God who creates, and a God who has this profound desire to share God's creation with a creature created in the divine image, the human being. But the human being has another idea, or rather, the human being wants to fulfill the human aspiration to be a self-creator. We're charged by God to be a partner in creation, and the greatest creation any one of us makes is our own selves, the personalities and lives that we create for ourselves. And that creative urge of a human being is impeded if you're even put into a paradise, because there's boundaries to that. And so the human being breaks out of God's paradise, begins living a life. And at the end of the Parsha last week, God is so disappointed that human beings have chosen ego themselves over the collective and filled the world with violence and filled the world with brokenness that God says, I'm going to destroy it all. And just before he destroys it all, just before God destroys it all, his eye catches one righteous person named Noah. And God decides, I will save Noah and his family. I will save a sampling of the life that lives on this earth, and I will destroy and cleanse the earth by destroying everything else. And so everything is destroyed, and we start again. God, as it were, thinks I couldn't create a partner to share my creation. I'll choose one, Noah. But then Noah repeats the pattern. After 10 generations of Noah, then the world is once again plunged into terrible violence and terrible brokenness. And God once again decides something must be done. But having made a promise not to destroy it, he can't do that again. So instead, he chooses someone. Well, that'll be next week's Torah portion. Abraham. I couldn't create a person to be my partner, says God, and I couldn't choose one. Maybe I can teach one. And that's the Abraham story. So this is the second act of a 3-act play, trying to achieve a human being who could share the partnership with God in creating a world of oneness. And the story that we're going to read, it's a fairy tale kind of story, and every little kid knows the story, except if you spend just one moment thinking about it, it's utterly terrifying. I mean, what is it like to be Noah? To stand on the bridge of that ark and watch the whole world destroyed? What would that be like? And if you were Noah and given the task of saving the best of the world, what would you take into the ark with you? Just those questions begin to open up the sort of sheer terror and depth of this story. So Sherre, tell me about the God of this story, the God of Noah.
So, first of all, I just want to say I love when you tell a story. You are the best storyteller. And I sort of go into this trance and I feel like I'm in kindergarten when, you would go to that really happy place when they're telling the story. I just feel that. So I just have to
You
say
sit
that,
on
and
your
you're
rug
not
with
the only
cookies.
one.
Sit on your rug with cookies and milk and listen to the story.
It really is like that. And I'm convinced I'm not the only one. So
Okay.
as I was kind of raptured in the story of Noah, so I read every week a woman named Erica Brown. Some of you may know her. She is amazing. She's at Yeshiva University, if you don't have her. And she talks a lot about this week with regards to this Parsha of God's vengeance, that God's seeking revenge. And I would even go further. I think God's anger is a mask for his disappointment, right? God, she really wants this to work. And when she sees that they are behaving badly, God is so upset. And that level of disappointment morphs into rage. And I think so often anger is just a mask for a sadness and a disappointment that we feel. So I think that's the first insight of today.
Mark, tell me about the God of Noah.
Yeah, I think this is a parsha about failure, and we've had it's really quite a concept. What does it mean for humans to fail, and what does it mean for God to fail? It's far more interesting to me because I'm always interested in God's machinations. For God to fail, so the theological problem is God is all powerful and all knowing and omnibenevolent, all good. And God knows everything. But there is one thing that God cannot know, and that is what we will choose to do next. That's the consequence of free will. And because God doesn't know that, there is a surprise for God, which is totally unique in the God of the whole Tanakh, really, and that is, I didn't realize that they couldn't handle freedom, and that they would choose badly. I couldn't imagine that because I don't choose badly. So here's the first.
So wait, how can you say that God doesn't choose badly when we see God misbehaving all throughout the book of Genesis and doing sort of turning Lot's wife into a pillar of salt? And so how can you say that?
Well, because I don't think that's behaving badly. God told them not to turn around and look at the city, and they did.
So anything that God does, even if it appears bad, has legitimacy because and therefore is not bad?
Well, that it sort of turns out that way, yes. I think the interpretation that an all-perfect God is behaving badly is a lazy interpretation, because it says, look, this doesn't seem right, but if you look deeper, it is right. Like the sacrifice of Isaac that we have talked about. It looks like it's a bad thing that God does, but actually it's a necessary test. Because
but that's so
wait. Sorry, wait. So we have two interpretations. So Marc's interpretation is that a God who's morally perfect encounters a human being who is not and can't understand him, or can't understand her, can't understand that creature. Look, all of us as parents have had this experience. You turn to the kid and say, "What were you thinking?"
Right.
And it's the difference between your level of intelligence and insight. You could see the consequences of bad decisions. The kid can't. So you say to the kid, "What were you thinking?" And the answer is the kid was thinking differently than you were. And in this case, you have a God who thinks differently than a human being and can't quite gather in. Why do you make these choices which are so self-destructive? And I think all of us have that impulse. You read the morning newspaper, you say that. So Marc, finish the thought, and then we'll talk. Sherry's idea was a different God. It's a different God. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just not signing on to any interpretation where God acts badly.
No, that's okay. But finish your thought about a perfect God. So a perfect God.
Go there, but I'm not going with you.
A perfect God. Go ahead.
This is an issue of the consequences of freedom.
Right.
And we'll see it later in the Exodus, where the only two beings that didn't know slavery, Moses and God, are completely at sea. They're completely lost in what it is to free slaves, because they can't relate to that. So I think this is the awareness, far from being vengeance, which it isn't at all. God's regretted. Regret is not vengeance. And there's no word of vengeance in there, nakama. None of that is in this story. But what God doesn't understand is what we will choose. And the consequence of freedom is failure, is the failure to choose the good. Now, God is always choosing the good for us, a world in which we have that freedom. And that freedom to choose badly is, according to Leibniz and others, a better world. it's actually a more perfect world, which is what a perfect God would create, than a world in which God constrains us, directs us, limits us, controls us. That is not a perfect world. That's a world in which we are ants or bees or some other flock animal that was created. God was trying to do a different thing. God was trying to allow people made in God's image to reach to a higher spiritual level, which involves failure, education, learning, repentance. It's the exact human drama. And because God isn't a human, not a he or a she, because God isn't a human, God can't understand at first our choices. But I think that's why God decides not to destroy the world again. Because God learns, because God is infinitely wise. He says, I see, I understand. This is the fate of my gift of freedom.
All right, so Sherre, Marc has presented us with a morally perfect God dealing with a morally imperfect human being. And the dissonance between those two realities is what this story is. You suggested a different image of God, a God who is at this moment not fully morally developed and sort of learning. And we're watching the moral development of the character of God. So take that up.
So Marc, it's so interesting to have this conversation with you, because a morally perfect God is a fixed God. And in my mind, a God that I'm describing is a God in process. And if we're made in God's image, what we share most with God is that we grow and God grows. I mean, Brad Artson talks about process theology, right? That God is in process. And it's in fact a much more, and you said it, God is learning. And I feel like I had this image of an AI God, right? From each input, God learns better about the kind of God she needs to be or he needs to be. And God gets smarter with the experiences and the inputs of all this interaction with humanity. So to me, it's not a fixed God that's perfect. It's a God that's very imperfect.
Well, learning is not imperfect. Learning is an aspect of perfection,
but it's a different.
What God learns is this is what freedom means. This is what my gift to them means, and this is what human.
But if God's
fallibility
perfect, God should have known that and should have done it from the get-go.
God did know that.
All right, so there it's time out. It's a wonderful contrast between two different ideas of what God's perfection is, right? Marc's idea of God perfection is a given, and Sherre's idea of Marc's perfection is a goal, and of God's perfection,
it's aspirational.
Aspirational, right? I want to turn your attention for a moment. We've talked about God, and I want to talk about Noah. I want to know something about this man. And we don't know much. The Torah only tells you a few tiny things. So as we construct the inner life of this man who witnesses this incredible trauma, the incredible trauma of watching a world be destroyed. And actually, if there was this movie with Russell Crowe, which had many flaws, but one of the things it did show was if you knew the catastrophe was coming, if you knew the apocalypse was coming, you'd be a lunatic. The world could not accept you. So I want you to tell me something about this man, Noah, about his moral quality, about his moral development, and what happens to a human being who witnesses what he witnesses. Marc, tell me something about Noah.
Well, okay, first of all, the term used for Noah is not that he was a good man, a fine man. It was ish tamim b'doratav. He was perfect in his generation. And the rabbis jump on that and they say, yeah, in another generation, he wouldn't have even made the top 10. But it was for his generation, he was as good as there was. It also shows the tremendous compassion and rachmanis, the chesed, the mercy, the goodness of God, because God could have easily destroyed Noah and his family along with everyone else. and just made new people. But God decides, no, I want to show that even one person is worth saving in a world in which the rest has basically forfeited their great gift of freedom to choose the good.
Sherre, tell me about this man, Noah. When you think about his inner life, what do you think about?
So I love that Marc mentioned that, he is, quote, perfect in his generation, but I can't stop thinking about the trauma that he experienced, really standing in his shoes. He's rushing to get every creature onto the boat. He's given extreme instructions. He shuts the door on humanity, and then he goes on this boat. It's like, this is a trauma story. This is incredibly traumatic for him. And at one point, the Midrash says, like, he looks out and it's still dark, and then he has to go back in and he looks again. I mean, this is like, he's in a flood and he's suffering. He doesn't know if he's going to survive, and let alone he's with all these animals and no bathrooms. I mean, the whole thing to me is a trauma story, and I'm surprised he even can recover at the end of it. And what we say, remember, he built a vineyard and he got drunk. I actually think he didn't recover from the trauma. I think it led him to, now this isn't a very sort of modern interpretation, but it led him to self-medicate, and because he couldn't recover from that trauma.
The first documented case of PTSD.
Well, and also did he become an alcoholic? I don't know, but this idea that he couldn't interpret and live with this trauma and had to use external substances to get through the rest of his life.
Mm. When I teach folks Bible, I always tell them that the Bible is myth with a capital M, which means a truth told in the form of a story. And so you don't tell the Bible in the past tense, you tell the Bible in the present tense. It's not a question of who was Noah. The question is, who is Noah? And what would it be like to be Noah? And if you knew that a calamity, an apocalypse was on the way, and you created a vessel to protect from that calamity, what would you bring into that vessel? What would you carry with you? What are the things, the artifacts and the elements of your reality that deserve to be protected from the calamity that's coming? And what do you need? What are the things that you need? And that kind of question just really haunts me.
I wrote a midrash for kids for a moment back in the day, and it was, how did Noah tell his friends that they couldn't come on the ark? And to me, that's the great trauma. It's not what he felt inside him, or that he turned his back. It's that he was put in the position to say to his friends, you can't come on the ark. And the line that I used in the Midrash is, look, I don't understand it. You were good enough for me, but you weren't good enough for God.
Oh my God, that's so beautiful, Marc.
And I think that's the trauma of it. But there's also, I think, in God's perfection and mercy, which is an amazing combination, God includes little clues to show how God has learned, because God had to learn, a perfect God had to learn what freedom meant for people. And that is, this parsha is the first permission in the Torah to eat meat. It's quite clear that in the garden, the only food given to Adam and Eve to eat was vegetables and fruits and berries. And then it specifically says, look, I know you want to, you have low instincts. You have animal instincts. I understand I created you half animal and half divine. And that's the struggle of Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara. I understand that. And part of your animal instinct is this, canines. You want to eat meat. And I didn't want you to kill anything, but okay, eat meat. Just don't eat it with its blood in it, because the blood is the life. And then it goes on to say, and furthermore, since you're likely to become more murderous when you see blood, I'm telling you, hashofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. If you kill another person, by your blood will be shed in punishment for it. So I think in Noah we see an act of God's mercy in understanding, look, I'm willing to let you live a lower human life, a lower moral life. And that creates the great lesson of the Torah to me, which is that the Torah operates on many levels. It isn't just a single order, a single level of commandment, be good or to hell with you. No, it's a commandment to live on the highest level you're capable of now, and then to try to raise your moral level as you grow. That's the world that God is creating, the post-diluvian world.
But that's not what happened with Noah.
No, it isn't, because they choose not to grow. The generations choose not to. They choose not to get to the higher level. And that's why I think Eddie's point is right, that with Abraham, there's another attempt. Okay, so humanity as a whole is not capable of receiving my message. Maybe a certain family in humanity is capable of receiving my message. And that's the Jewish family, not the Jewish people yet. That doesn't happen till Exodus, but it's a Jewish family. And that's why all the moral aspirations of God now devolve upon a single family. And that doesn't work either. And that leads to God's next attempt, which is, okay, how about a whole people? If it's not one family, now it could be the Jewish people that could understand my message. And if you look at the whole Tanakh, even that fails as well. So God,
it's still in process.
Yeah, it's in process, but not by the end of the Tanakh.
Yeah, it's true, and not even by the end of our history in 4,000 years. But we're still at it. I'm going in today to teach the same Torah that.
And God's still waiting for us to make the right choice.
There you go.
To me, that's an act of patience and love.
Right, and it's out of this catastrophe that God begins to understand that you've got to move people morally step by step. It's interesting that the first commandments now come out of this thing. So let's talk for a moment about, as use the fancy phrase, post-diluvian world. Noah comes out of the ark. The world is pristine. It has been cleansed clean of its evil. He opens the doors and the animals fill the world. He opens the windows, he opens the doors, and his family comes out of the ark. And God puts a rainbow in the sky. It's a beautiful symbol, saying, I will not upset the processes of nature again to destroy the world. So tell me about this world. Tell me about that covenant and that moment of coming out of the ark.
Marc, you speak so beautifully about the rainbow. I want you to defer to you first, because I always love how you talk about the rainbow.
Well, the rainbow is the proof that the Torah is given on many levels. And the proof of it is that light is given on many levels. That light has different colors in it. And all of it together is white light. All of it together is God. But it's divided into different colors. So the rainbow is a reminder, first of all, that God is always present. And that you should never, ever despair of God's presence, that you live in a world where you are accompanied. You are accompanied. You are by God at every step of your life, and then after your life in the world to come. That's what the rainbow is for me, and it's a natural indication that the world is diverse, morally diverse, racially diverse, diverse in abilities and talents and in animal instincts, and that we have to embrace the entire rainbow and not just think if we can't be like God, then to hell with everyone. No. What we have to realize is that every single decision we make is made with, as the rabbi said, an angel and an angel on our shoulders to just judge and urge us to be better. And Lincoln said it best of all. He called it the better angels of our nature. And the entire Torah is about humanity's attempt to respond to the better angels of its nature and to fail and succeed. You know, there's tremendous successes in the Torah that we also have to point to. And one of those successes is the revival of humanity after the flood. It does raise, however, for me, another interesting question that kids always ask, and that is, wait a minute, the world was filled after the Garden of Eden. Where were the other people? Who were these other people if it was only Adam and Eve? The same thing is repeated in the flood. Here's everyone's destroyed. It's just Noah's family. Wait a minute. How'd they fill the earth? Was it all gigantic incest? And that's how they filled the world? And so it does show that there are certain questions the Torah isn't that interested in. Because in myth, as you describe it, Eddie, you know, there's certain large questions that the story is about. The little details, that's not what myth is about.
Right. Sherre, tell me about this post-flood world.
Well, I think it's very timely right now because there are seasons in the evolution of humanity, and Noah's season is a tough one. And then he emerges to this rainbow, which is a promise of a season that's beautiful. And I can't think of a more timely time to talk about this because we're in a tough season. And what does it mean to look for the rainbow and to be a part of building a new world? So I think the rainbow is a metaphor. And I love what Marc said about the diversity, but I also think the rainbow is a metaphor for what's our responsibility to building a new world? What do we need to contribute as opposed to waiting for someone else to fix it? And what do we need to do? And I think it's very timely for this week.
And God will not destroy the world again. Nature will proceed according to its own course. But what he doesn't say is, you will not destroy the world. And that's the great responsibility. The world is put into our hands now. We have the power. And the question is, do we have the divine wisdom that it takes to manage a world like this one? That's a very powerful, in some ways, painful question to ask.
Yeah,
Go ahead, please.
Let me just say one thing about that. There's a lot of despair about our world. And you know, if you look at the news, you have every reason to be despairing. But because I was the religion reporter for ABC with Tommy, we knew exactly how Good Morning America was going to set up every morning. We looked for the bloodiest, most despairing story, and we knew that was the story that was going to lead the morning news, because if it bleeds, it leads. I want to take a different course, and I want to say, we are living at the best possible moment in human history. And I refer you to Steven Pinker's new book about that. He shows how we've really advanced as humanity to an unbelievable degree. Infant mortality, creating vaccines for hundreds of heretofore fatal illnesses, massive increases in the productivity of agriculture, tremendous understandings about the diversity of human life and our instincts and our impulses. This is as good as it has ever been. I will make that argument. I'm a big Leibnizian. I think this is the best of all possible worlds. And I believe that God has succeeded through us to convey this idea that you just keep working for the good. Now, everyone isn't working for the good, but you can't just listen to news, and you can't just read papers which describe the habits of the worst among us. You have to be open to being astounded and amazed by all of our successes and all of the triumphs that
I
humanity has made.
100% agree with you, Mark. And you have two hands. In one hand, you can hold all the astonishment and wonder and awe that we have done in this last century. And in the other hand, you can have despair and realize this is incredibly sad what is happening in the world right now and what's brewing. And so to me, those are not, it's not one or the other. I think part of why we have two hands is because we hold contradictory emotions, feelings, ideas, and we have to wrestle with them. Thus, we are Israel. So yes, and.
That was the, Mark, that was the Voltaire to your Leibniz. Leibniz said this is the best of all possible universes because that's what a perfect God would create. And Voltaire wrote a satire called Candide, where all these horrible things happen. And at the end of each one is, well, that's the best of all possible universes. And Sherry's right. What Voltaire was pointing to, of course, was, and you're right, Mark, you're half right, that the world is remarkable at this moment, no question. But we also have a tremendous capacity to deny the catastrophes about us, to deny the evil that exists in the world, to close our eyes to the calamities. And that's what Voltaire was making fun of. Go ahead, please.
What is remarkable is that I've read Candide and Voltaire years ago, and that you can just pull it up like it's part of.
Well, he mentioned Leibniz, so I got to mention Voltaire.
I mean,
so.
wow. I was
all right, before we finish, today is also an anniversary, okay? And I'll tell you, not many people know this. So 50 years ago this week, a very young, dark-haired, bow-tied rabbi from New York named Marc Gellman published a modern midrash, a modern retelling of a Bible story in Moment magazine, which then was and still is a very, very nice Jewish literary magazine. It was called The Last Hamburger. It was his first midrash. He produced many, many, many more after that, and they're all beautiful and wonderful and deep. But that was his first. And the funny thing is, well before I ever met Rabbi Gellman, I found that midrash. I cherish that midrash. I have taught that midrash because not only is it a great story, which I cherish, but it is a wonderful classic. It is a classic example of how midrash works. And it is this week, 50 years ago, in honor of the birth of his daughter, that he wrote this midrash. So I think on behalf of children and students everywhere, no matter what your age, Rabbi, tell us the story of the last hamburger, or the first hamburger, rather. The first hamburger, right.
Yeah. My friend drew the graphics for it, which was beautiful, Larry Levy. He had a cow with a tear coming down her cheek, and the cow was on two big buns. It was a living, and that was the graphics for it. So it's a story about how at the beginning, everyone ate fruits and nuts, and they were happy with it. But then one day, Noah decided, I want a hamburger. And he didn't know exactly what it was. He just knew he wanted a hamburger. So he went to his friend the cow. He said, I want a hamburger. You know how I can get a hamburger? The cow looked at him and said, have some more grass and forget about it. Then the snake says, hey, over here. No. He said, you want a hamburger? Here's what you got to do. You got to kill a cow, chop up her meat, and fry it in a pan. And no, so I can't do that. The cow's my friend. I talk to her every day. He said, yeah, she's your friend. You want a hamburger? That's what you got to do. Well, Noah really wanted a hamburger, and he did what the snake said. But the next day, when he went into the fields, the birds flew away from him. The fish swam away from him. All the animals that he talked to every day ran away from Noah. In fact, since the day when Noah ate the first hamburger, No animal has ever spoken to a person. They're still too angry.
It's a wonderful story. They're still that mad.
That's right.
That's a wonderful story, Mark. And for
It's
50 years, let's just stop for a moment and say a nice thing. For 50 years of sharing beautiful midrash with all of us, you have our prayers, our blessings. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's
Thank
my
you.
greatest joy to have been able to revive midrash for our time.
It is a beautiful midrash. Rabbi Marc, Rabbi Sherre, thank you for sharing Torah with me this morning. It's always a joy. And to everyone who's listening this morning, Shabbat Shalom. Have a wonderful Shabbos Noach. Go out and do something good for the world. That would be the best way to celebrate the heroism and the vision of Noach and the moral progress that God wishes for us all. We'll see each other next week. Davening from Valley Beth Shalom, morning prayers following this, of course, and all week we have our learning and our prayers together. So have a very, very good Shabbos and a good week after that. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.